Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brasher.
Joining me today is a new guest to discuss a new topic. Dr. Mark Gloutney, Ducks Unlimited Canada's Director of Regional Operations for Eastern Canada and British Columbia. And Mark is going to be sharing with us some of what he does for DU Canada, covering some of the other habitats outside of the prairies and outside of the boreal that we have already heard from over the past year or so from Dr. Scott Stevens. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Mike, it's nice to join you.
Your title is reminiscent of others that or at least one other that we've heard about, and that's Dr. Scott Stevens. I believe he is going to be your counterpart within Ducks Unlimited Canada. He's Director of Regional Operations for the Prairies and Boreal. So you guys kind of have similar responsibilities for the organization, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have the same responsibilities. We just split the country in two parts.
And so Director of Regional Operations for Eastern Canada and British Columbia. The geographers in our audience, among our listener audience, will know that British Columbia is not in Eastern Canada. So give us some insight on that.
Sure. So Eastern Canada is the 6 eastern provinces: Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and Labrador. And, British Columbia is clearly on the west coast. This was kind of a situation that arose through opportunity when we went from 3 DROs to 2 directors of regional operations. And we split the Les Bogdan's region, with Scott taking the boreal forest and I took BC. It's not that surprising. The issues and realities in British Columbia and the conservation challenges and opportunities are really not that dissimilar from what we're dealing with in Eastern Canada. The drivers, are similar. The effects of climate change and sea level rise, expansion of urban populations, those kind of things are pretty similar. So the conservation programs, while being, somewhat different, they're responding to similar stressors.
Yeah, and Dr. Stevens is one of those inlanders. He doesn't have a whole lot of experience with those coastal systems, so we probably couldn't entrust him with caring for those coastal systems in British Columbia, right?
That's right.
We have a lot of fun with Scott. He is probably our most frequent guest, being very gracious and joining us anytime we ask him to. And he's done a great job over the past 2 or 3 years, ever since we've started this podcast, of keeping us updated on habitat conditions, waterfowl populations, migration status in the prairies, and also touching on the boreal a little bit as well. This is a great opportunity to hear from you, to hear from other regions. We've had some listener comments asking us to give a bit more coverage to the Atlantic Flyway and some of the breeding waterfowl habitats that are responsible for producing birds that travel into the Atlantic Flyway. And so we wanted to do this for quite a while, and the listener comment kind of provided an additional stimulus for doing so. And so I thank you for sharing your time here today, Mark, and kind of helping us with this conversation. Tell you what, given that this is the first time you have been on the podcast, how about we start with just a brief introduction to you as from a personal and professional perspective?
So I've been with Ducks Unlimited for 24 years, I guess. Started in Atlantic Canada, helping with developing their conservation program, then moved to managing Atlantic Canada, then took on some responsibilities with coordinating our science activities in Eastern Canada, and then moved on to taking on the regional responsibilities for Eastern Canada, and then in the last couple of years took on the British Columbia opportunity. I've been associated with waterfowl and waterfowling my entire life. My dad and family were avid waterfowlers, grew up in that kind of environment. I found the other day my Ducks Unlimited GreenWinged badge that I got probably in 1970 or 69 when I first became a member of Ducks Unlimited as a GreenWing. So that was pretty cool. I've still got one of those old GreenWing badges, sort of mint in box. So might be worth something on eBay.
I'm pretty sure it is. It's amazing. a lot of that early memorabilia, those early badges, hats, whatever you want to talk about. Yeah, they bring with them some value now. So that's pretty cool. I didn't realize that you had been associated with DU for quite that long.
Yeah, basically all my life, right?
Yeah.
So it's pretty amazing to actually have the opportunity to work, for the company.
Yeah, and that's a story that holds true for many of our staff, both within DU Inc. as well as DU Canada, as well as DU de Mexico, I'm sure. And so, yeah, it's a great organization to work for. We have a lot of support and all that, and a lot of through the years, and we try to do good things. And so that's what we're here to talk about with you in terms of some of the other important breeding waterfowl habitats there in Canada. And at some point in the future, I believe we'll have an opportunity to get back in touch with you and talk about the different types of conservation activities that we do in those landscapes and that we have done for many decades. But for today, I think what we want to do is just kind of focus in on a description of those areas, and to the extent that you can, we'll eventually get you to give your best assessment, sort of subjectively based assessment based on what you're hearing, anecdotal observations and reports here over the past year of how habitat conditions were in those regions. And as we go through this, it'll probably be instructive to do some comparing and contrasting to the prairies in terms of the variability that we see there in the prairies and the drought that's developed. And then, like, what is the boreal forest and the other waterfowl habitats from eastern Canada look like in that regard? So let's just jump in right here. And I guess what I would do, Mark, is ask you to provide an overview, a general description of the type of waterfowl habitats that we have, breeding waterfowl habitats that we have there in eastern Canada. Let's start there, and then we can jump over and touch on British Columbia here a little bit as well.
Sure. When I think about the breeding habitats in eastern Canada, I kind of think about them in grades and gradations. And we'll start we've got coastal habitats, and coastal habitats along our marine coasts of the Maritime and Atlantic provinces, as well as Quebec, where there's sort of salt tidal influence on those coastal systems. And that's kind of one main habitat type that we have. That grades if you come back through the St. Lawrence system, up the St. Lawrence and up the Ottawa rivers. We have lots of coastal wetlands that are freshwater, that are really important habitats for waterfowl, both from a breeding and a staging perspective. So along the St. Lawrence and along the Great Lakes, those coastal habitats are some of the key features that we focus on. When you move sort of back from the coast, you get into where people live. People live along the coast, but also, they live in that agricultural landscape of southern Ontario, down the Ottawa River, down the St. Lawrence through Quebec. Lots of the people live in Atlantic Canada, within that agricultural landscape. So that's another sort of key landscape for us. It's where people live. It's where the high productive soils are. It's where those highly productive wetlands in our landscape are. It's where the majority of the impact has been historically over the last 400 years as European settlement came. Then you sort of grade to the north and you start to get into the forest, and sort of that first tranche of forest is sort of cottage country. Much of that forest has nice lakes with marshy edges around them in many places, and streams and rivers that connect them, that are populated by beavers, that are providing really important breeding areas for a multitude of different waterfowl species. Again, lots of people are in those landscapes. They're living and recreating in those landscapes. And then you grade north from there into the I guess the broader commercial forest, where we have much less presence of people. You've got a bigger presence of logging and forestry type activities in there. Lots of wetlands, lots of beaver ponds, lots of beaver flowage, lots of river creek systems in that landscape. And then you continue to grade north and you get out of the commercial forest into the top end of the boreal forest, and then we grade up into James Bay lowlands and all of those really high value, high quality wetlands along the coast of James Bay and Hudson's Bay, up into the Arctic areas in Quebec, and which are really important for things like Atlantic population of Canada geese. I think what's a little different in our agricultural landscapes in the region is, it's more of a riverine system. It's not like prairie potholes where you've got these isolated and not interconnected potholes and sloughs. Our landscape is much more linear in its nature, and historically, would have been forested with creeks that were dammed periodically by beavers and supporting, significant numbers of black ducks in that landscape.
It is a huge area with a great diversity of waterfowl habitats is what you're saying. Yeah, we're going to paint this picture as best we can, and you've done a fantastic job of doing so. I want to quickly jump over to British Columbia and have you talk about that as well.
Sure.
So give that a shot.
Sure. So in British Columbia, you can think about two main areas from a waterfowl perspective. Sort of the interior central part of the province, the north of Kamloops, called the Caribou-Chilcotin area. It's a mid-elevation area or lower elevation area. Lots of branching and grassland in that area. Lots of river systems, but also basins, wetland basins within there. It's a pretty cool place, hugely productive for waterfowl. I think in that area, when I stand on the edges of a bunch of those wetlands, it really reminds me of being at a prairie wetland. There's just the diversity of species and the abundance of broods that we see in some of those wetlands is pretty amazing. So you start in the interior in a ranching landscape, and that's kind of some of our main focuses is to kind of restore and work there. And then the other really important part of the landscape is the coast. And the coast provides, important wintering and staging habitats, all those estuaries and all the important farmland activities around the estuaries that provide food for our wintering waterfowl are key features. The other part of the province that's really important from a waterfowl perspective is the northeast corner, which is the Peace Country. And that's an extension of the prairie systems. So the Prairie Ecosystem comes into northeastern British Columbia in the Peace and along the Peace River systems, and it really is prairie habitat in there.
From a breeding waterfowl standpoint, outside of the Peace Parkland there, is the primary focus in, did I understand correctly, that it's in the interior portion of British Columbia there?
Yeah, so the big production areas for British Columbia is the interior of the province. There certainly is some production along the coast, but the vast majority of it happens in the interior. And if you look at our international conservation plan, that area jumps up as a level 2 continental priority.
And to give people an idea of the importance of that area or the number of waterfowl that breed in interior British Columbia, I'm looking at a report here, and over the past 13 or so years, estimates from the Breeding Population Survey in interior British Columbia have been anywhere from 300,000, actually a little bit less than 300,000, but up to 410,000. So just to kind of give you an idea of the density or the total number of birds that we have nesting there, breeding there. I want to jump back over, Mark, and for the remainder of this discussion, I think we'll focus on Eastern Canada, just for the ease of kind of discussing how conditions may have unfolded and what it may mean for waterfowl hunters and those that appreciate waterfowl here in the eastern U.S. We'll have an opportunity some other time to focus on breeding habitats there in British Columbia, Alaska, Western Boreal Forest, and how they may influence waterfowl populations in the Pacific Flyway. And actually, we've already had a bit of a discussion about that with Dr. Mark Petrie on an earlier episode where we were actually discussing drought in the Pacific Flyway. Mark did a pretty good job summarizing what we think we understand about breeding habitat conditions and populations in the those areas in the Pacific Flyway this year. So let's jump back over to Eastern Canada. And now that we have a general idea of the type of breeding habitats that we're going to be seeing in that region, you've also talked about some of the habitats that are important for non-breeding for waterfowl during the non-breeding period. And we can even save that for a future episode as well. But for now, let's try to focus on the kind of breeding habitat conditions. And perhaps a useful thing to add here are the dominant, what are the dominant waterfowl species that we see utilizing those Eastern Canada habitats?
The flagship species, I think there's two flagship species. Certainly when you think about the East, the black duck sort of comes to mind as, that flagship dominant species that everybody sort of loves and likes and appreciates, that elusive sort of black duck that comes down in the fall and is such a beautiful bird. And you think about another sort of hallmark species would be the common eider. When we live in our coastal communities, it's the other sort of dominant one. It's the bird that in Newfoundland and Labrador, is the prized one for a New Year's Christmas Eve dinner. Would be a roast eider, would be something of great value. So those are sort of two of the main dominant species. We have certainly really big populations of wood ducks, and wood duck populations have been expanding over the last decades. Mallards, of course, have been expanding into Eastern Canada since the 1950s. Unlike south of us, our mallard populations are pretty stable. They've increased dramatically. I think we're getting at the point where that population growth is starting to plateau as the birds have basically filled the available habitat. And we're not really seeing that decline in mallards that's being seen in some of our states just south of us. Golden eyes as well, both common golden eyes and Barrow's golden eyes are an important species. And, for many of our colleagues down in the south, we produce lots of ringnecks and hooded mergansers are birds of big abundance.
What about GreenWinged Teal? They are a species that we associate with boreal forest. You have a pretty good number of those?
Yeah, we have good production of greenwings out of the woods, as well as you get a little farther north, kind of south of James Bay, banding through Quebec up into Manitoba. There's a big band of area where lots of scoters are nesting as well. And then, of course, when you get farther north, you've got snow geese. Snow geese are, I guess, north of Quebec and into the territories. But Canada geese, are breeding along James Bay, Hudson's Bay. I guess snow geese along James Bay as well. And then up in the Ungava Peninsula, we've got all of the Atlantic population of Canada geese, and then the North Atlantic population breeding through, eastern Quebec and Labrador and Newfoundland.
What about another species that we associate with boreal forest is American widgeon. Now, they're primarily a western bird, though, right? We don't see a great number of widgeon in the eastern boreal, do we?
There's some. I mean, the reality in our eastern boreal forest is we don't have the same density of waterfowl that we see in the western boreal forest. There's a much lower productivity in that system. The glaciers basically pushed all of the soil away, so the productivity of those landscapes are diminished. So we've got lower densities of birds than the western boreal forest, but we've got good diversity of species, including widgeons, and it's just a huge geography. So there's lots of birds produced out of that geography just on the basis of how big it is.
I'm looking at a table here in one of the population status reports, and it summarizes data from each of the past, 20 or so years on the 6 most abundant duck species or kind of duck species groups when you think about golden eyes and mergansers, where they lump multiple species in these counts here. In the Eastern Survey area, which includes, for most of these species is going to be some combination of eastern Canada as well as some portion of the northeastern U.S. And across that region, for those six species or species groups, we're looking at somewhere around 4 million, 3.5 to 5 million ducks in the breeding population. Now, there's more that doesn't include wood ducks. It doesn't include some of the others that we've talked about, Widgeon. Certainly doesn't include the scoters, the eiders in these counts. So there's millions of waterfowl that breed in eastern Canada and northeastern U.S. And so those are all the ones that we cover and that are affected by the habitat conservation work that we do. Mark, I want to shift a little bit now and see if we can talk about habitat conditions this year. We have focused, rightly so, a lot on providing updates about the status of the drought, the status of wetland conditions, breeding population, kind of assessments in the prairies. The prairies, as we all know, are a highly dynamic landscape. Rainfall comes in bunches, and then we go through drought, and then we're in the grips of a pretty severe drought right now. But the boreal forest across Canada are a really useful contrast to the prairies in terms of the year-to-year variation that we see in precipitation and resulting wetland conditions. And we've heard about this from Scott with regard to the western boreal forest. That same pattern pretty well holds in eastern Canada as well, right?
Overall, I mean, not just the boreal, but all of our landscapes are not subject to that same variability that we see in the prairie systems. So, typically things are more stable from year to year to year. But we're seeing with climate change and with over the last decade, it's changing. There are certainly differences now than there were 20 years ago. For example, we have more periods where it is drier and than we've had historically. And we're seeing, rains coming in much more intense events as opposed to, historically where we might have had 2 or 3 inches of rain over 2 or 3 days. We're seeing those come in big rain events now. So it's changing the dynamics of our wetlands a little and changing sort of inundation of some of these wetlands. And we're seeing sort of more wetlands generally being a little more stressed more often than we've seen historically. Last year we had huge droughts in Atlantic Canada, which are very unusual. This year we had a very dry spring in Ontario and Quebec, and so that's a little different. But going on to sort of what do habitat conditions look like over the last year? In Ontario and Quebec, we had a very dry and hot spring, which meant that we didn't have as much small sheet water and small ponds and ephemeral ponds, which are really important for stopping birds and for settling birds on our landscape. So I think the number of birds that actually nested within our settled part of the landscape, within the agricultural landscape, were probably a bit lower than we would see historically. That was sort of countered by the fact that it was pretty nice weather and we didn't see any cold snaps during the periods, cold ret snaps during the period when, ducklings were typically hatching. So I think the, duckling survival from a weather perspective was better early on. I think another factor along our river systems, the St. Lawrence, Ottawa system, was a year of low flooding. So in years like 2019 and 2017, where we had huge floods, a large part of the floodplain was underwater and unavailable for breeding during that main period where ducks were trying to find places to nest. So this year we certainly had lots of places for the birds in the floodplains to nest, and I think that was good. In Atlantic Canada, things were good. We had also a pretty mild spring, but the conditions had rebounded from the drought. We didn't see any cold, wet days late May, early June. So there was lots of broods produced and lots of big black duck broods were seen sort of early on. So, overall, I think in that settled part of the landscape, production was, average or maybe a little below average. In the forested landscape, things are pretty stable. and we didn't see any kind of big environmental shifts in terms of drought happening out there. So I would expect that production out of our forest systems was average.
You know, one of the things that makes it challenging on a year-to-year basis to sort of empirically assess what habitat conditions are within that vast Eastern Canada landscape is the fact that we don't, even when we have the breeding population surveys being conducted, of course, this year and last year, we did not have those surveys conducted in Eastern Canada. They did conduct surveys in the northeastern U.S. this year in 2021. But even in the years where we are conducting the surveys in Eastern Canada, I don't think there are habitat metrics that are recorded along those surveys, are there? So we don't really have we aren't able to say what the wetland count is, quote, wetland count is in Eastern Canada the way we were able to do for pond counts in the prairies. And it's just a different type of wetland landscape. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, that's correct. We don't have like a May pond count. And it's not surprising because it would not provide you with any information that you could use to discriminate what the population was going to be, because you would basically have the same count year on year.
Yeah, the wetlands are certainly not as dynamic, but I will say that I'm gaining greater appreciation for some of the dynamics of the wetlands that do occur there, especially those in the floodplain system, the St. Lawrence River Valley, and the fact that flooding can basically eliminate nesting habitat for some of the birds in the spring. That type of dynamic isn't always immediately obvious to me, having not spent much time in that landscape during the breeding season. So I appreciate that. One of the other questions that people may be wondering, and we've talked about this a great deal with Scott, is that given drought in the prairies, and we talk about how birds that are returning to the prairies and they encounter dry conditions are likely to overfly the prairies, go into the western boreal forest. Do we know anything about whether birds from the prairies during drought years would kind of filter into the eastern boreal forest? Is that a level of information that's too fine for us to really understand right now?
I don't think we know a lot about that. Again, I think the challenge becomes, the productivity of our eastern forests and the wetlands within them are different than our western forests, right? When they go up into the western boreal forest, there's pretty good productivity on those wetland systems. Certainly not the same level that we see in the prairies, but they're still pretty good, and you get good densities of birds occurring on those systems. In our eastern boreal forest systems, it's a beaver pond flowage dominated system. There's lots of ducks, but the density is certainly not there. So I'm not sure that there's that much creep out of the prairies into the east. I mean, maybe if I had to guess, it would be into the northwestern part of Ontario, into that kind of northwest south of James Bay and Hudson's Bay.
Yeah, that would be my thought too there, Mark. I just wanted to ask the question because I try to think about the type of things that may come to mind as we're listening to this, and just want to try to answer some of those questions, certainly in light of what we're seeing across that prairie landscape this year. And I guess I've talked here and mentioned a lot about the importance of Eastern Canada and northeastern U.S. for providing birds to the Atlantic Flyway during the non-breeding season, but that's not the only. That's not where not like all of the birds in Eastern Canada, the areas that you cover, go to the Atlantic Flyway. The breeding waterfowl in that region do come down through the Mississippi Flyway as well. I haven't looked at harvest distribution statistics lately, but I suspect that as you get into the Central Flyway, the contribution of Eastern Canada and northeastern U.S. habitats markedly drops off. But those areas in Eastern Canada that you cover, northeastern U.S., do provide birds into the Mississippi Flyway as well, but certainly are dominantly important for the Atlantic Flyway. Have you been able to get out and do any hunting yet this year? And I'm just kind of curious what you're seeing as we start to wrap up this episode.
Sure. I mean, I just on the point about the Central Flyway, many of the birds produced in Ontario are going down that flyway. And then sort of the birds in the western part of Quebec kind of split between the two flyways that way. I've been out a couple of times this year. Our season opened Saturday before last. And then I've sort of been talking to some of our volunteers and looking at the social media feeds as well. So my experience personally was I had the same place early in the year, year over year. What I saw this year was a lot more black ducks in the birds flying around than I'd seen over the last decade. So, it was interesting this year. We have to be careful about not shooting more black ducks than we were allowed to. Just there was that many within the birds we were seeing.
Well, that's encouraging.
Yeah, it was good, and I'm hearing kind of similar things from others that it seems to be lots of black ducks around, certainly in eastern Ontario. The other thing I'm seeing lots of and hearing lots of, people are pretty excited about how many wood ducks are around this year. So that's kind of building on what we saw last year. Last year was a huge year for wood ducks, and lots of wood ducks were harvested, and people really enjoyed that increase in wood ducks. They've always been an important part of the bag in Ontario and Quebec. But, more so in the last year, and then this year starting out the same way. We're hearing, reasonable numbers of mallards kicking around. Some green wings are starting to show up. Blue wings are all gone. But, we have very few blue wings now in Eastern Canada. We used to have big populations, but that's changed pretty dramatically over the last 50 years. So the reports out of the field are, people are seeing birds. They're seeing sort of good mixes of birds, and sort of black ducks and wood ducks seem to be pretty prevalent.
I appreciate this, Mark. I'll reiterate that I'm gaining new insights and new ways of thinking and understanding waterfowl and waterfowl habitats there in Eastern Canada. So I have a lot of things running through my mind here. The changes that you're seeing in terms of blue-winged teal, certainly the changes that you're seeing in terms of wood ducks. It makes me curious about what the trajectory of the wood duck population is in that region. I don't know what the answer to that is, and I'm not going to ask you right now. That's a topic for a future episode, and a lot of other things come to mind here. We haven't even talked about the type of conservation activities and priorities and science priorities that we have there in Eastern Canada, and so those are areas that are rich for discussion as well. So I think what we'll do here is I'll just say thank you for joining us and for introducing us to the waterfowl habitats, waterfowl populations of Eastern Canada as well as British Columbia. Any final remarks for us here? And then, like I said, we'll get you back on some other time.
Well, happy to come back and talk about some of the work that we're doing on the ground and some of the opportunities and challenges that exist here in the East and British Columbia.
Mark, thank you so much for your time today, for joining us on the Ducks Unlimited podcast, and we will take you up on the offer to join us again.
Thanks, Mike.
A very special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Mark Gloutney, Ducks Unlimited Canada's Director of Regional Operations for Eastern Canada and British Columbia. We appreciate his time in joining us here today. And as always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, who always does a wonderful job getting these episodes out to you. And to you, our listener, we thank you for your time and sharing it with us, and we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.